Thank you. My name is Michael McNamara. I'm a filmmaker at Markham Street Films here in Toronto, and I'm also on the board. I'm also a board member of the Documentary Organization of Canada, Toronto chapter, also known as Doc Toronto. Doc is the collective voice of over 800 independent Canadian filmmakers committed to creating important and compelling documentaries that are celebrated around the world. We provide support for documentary professionals through industry research, advocacy work, training, and mentorship programs. We also work to ensure there is support and shelf space for Canadian documentaries on Canadian screens. And we exist to celebrate the achievements of our members. Doc Toronto is thrilled to be working with the TIFF Doc Conference again this year, co-presenting yesterday's session with Al Jazeera America, and this next conversation with Doc member Sarah Polley. Sarah Polley began her acting career at the age of 4, and since then has worked with drama legends like Cronenberg, Egoyan, Gilliam, Hartley, Wenders, and Winterbottom. And she began to tell stories of her own, writing and directing Alice Munro's Away From Her, which received an Academy Award nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay, and Take This Waltz, which premiered at TIFF in 2011. A year later, she released her first documentary, Stories We Tell. Brian D. Johnson called it a brilliant film, an enthralling, exquisitely layered masterpiece. She tells brave stories with an original and powerful voice, and she does all doc makers proud. Now, she's the only doc maker I know with a star on Canada's Walk of Fame, and the only doc maker I know with a song that's been written about her. In June of this year, she was honored at the Governor General's Performing Arts Awards. Her award was introduced with a short film tribute by the wonderful artist Anne-Marie Fleming called Stories Sarah Tells. It has a catchy refrain. Sarah Polley likes to tell stories, and if they're messy, she has no worries. La, 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 la. Come on, sing along. Okay. Anyway, Anne-Marie sang that at a much higher voice than I did. Today, Sarah tells stories to us and to TIFF International Documentary Programmer Tom Powers. Please welcome Sarah and Tom.
So I have to say, early in the summer, I called up Jackie Garrow at Doc Toronto, as I do every summer, to kind of brainstorm about things that might appeal to the audience here for Doc Conference. And I said, well, who would you like to see at Doc Conference this year? And number one, she said, Sarah Polley. I said, I don't know, that's hard to do. But thank you for being here, because that was our fondest hope, that we could have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start on a kind of topical and truly more somber note, which is we're both wearing these buttons, Free Tarek and John. Can you, for the benefit of anyone who maybe doesn't know what this campaign is, just kind of briefly describe what this campaign is?
Sure. So John Grayson, who's a beloved Canadian filmmaker and has been a huge mentor to me and so many other filmmakers in Canada, and his friend Dr. Tarek Lubani, who's an emergency room doctor, have been held for 25 detained for 25 days without charges in Egypt. We are calling for their immediate release and asking people to talk about it. Go to tarekandjohn.com, sign the petition at change.org, Free Tarek and John, and please just keep this conversation as much as you possibly can in the public eye, in the media, and until they're released. We're obviously incredibly concerned about their safety, and there are these buttons floating around the festival. There aren't many left, I don't think, but if you can find one, wear one. But please go online and check in with the website to see anything you can do. Call the Egyptian embassy as often as you can.
I'd say last year at the festival, I was wearing a button that said Free Orwa for the Syrian filmmaker Orwa Nairabi, who during the festival last year was detained, in fact, in more mysterious circumstances, in that we didn't really know precisely. I forget the timeline. Who had taken him, and happy to say that this spring I had lunch with Orwa in New York. His detention was ultimately very short. I can't remember how many days, but it may not even been as many as Tarek and John have been. And but there had been truly a kind of massive campaign the way that you and your friends have been leading. And he told me at one point, one of his jailers came in and said, "How do you know Robert De Niro?" Because Robert De Niro had signed a petition, and Orwa truly credits that campaign with eventually getting his release. So
that's really good to know. Yeah, we've had an amazing outpouring of support from people like, Ben Affleck and, every kind of, star that we managed to get our hands on at TIFF signed the letter or is wearing the button. So you never know if these things are going to have an impact, but we certainly hope it will do something. I know that if anybody in this room was in the same situation right now, John would be leading the campaign in a much more efficient, creative, energetic way than we are. So it's just one of those things where you hope you're doing everything you can or that he would do for somebody else.
Well, thank you for speaking about that and being such a leader in that. Last year, we were so proud to show the North American premiere of Stories We Tell, and I can remember in the lead up to it, there was this shroud of secrecy around the film, and I felt anxious about it, and I can remember the sort of precisely timed moments when you made a kind of first statement about it, and I wonder if you can kind of talk about that feeling as you'd been working on this story for a long time, and what were you going through as this was about to be unveiled to the world?
Well, it had always been our dream. I mean, we had talked extensively, me, Anita Lee, our producer, Iris Ng, cinematographer, and Mike Munn, who's the editor, and everyone involved in the NFB and the film. It had always been our dream for no one to know anything about the film before the first screening, and for nothing to be written about what the film was about before the first screening, because we really wanted the film to stand on its own two legs, for better or for worse. We kind of wanted it to be judged on its own merits, and we felt that the sort of soap opera-ish quality of the story on paper would kind of overshadow the film itself. And to be honest, the whole point of making the film would have been kind of obliterated. I mean, the whole point of making this film was, if this story is going to be out there, everybody has to have at least a moment to tell their version. It can't just be my version. It can't just be my dad's version. It can't just be Harry's version. It can't, it can't be a journalist's version who doesn't know any of us. The idea was we have to all have a moment to speak together, not necessarily equally, but to be present. So the idea that it could just fall into like some journalist's hands who's had 100 other things to write that week for TIFF or for Venice, or it was really horrifying, and felt like it would have been a waste of 5 years of my life. And so we were all on tenterhooks, and we all got cold feet at various points. I mean, distributors, us. There was always a moment where, oh my God, I think that by the time the TIFF press conference happens, someone's just going to figure this out and write about it. So let's just come out with it now, and then it would be like, okay, let's hold back. Let's hold 2 weeks. It was always this debate about, do we just come out with it now, or do we hold on to it? And I don't think any of us believed we would be able to keep it totally secret until that first screening. And miraculously, it was kept a secret. And I think that's partly due to the fact that a lot of journalists in this country have a lot more integrity than elsewhere, and just sat on the secret of the story, and so weren't necessarily looking for this to be in a film.
I mean, this film, like any personal film, has another dimension to it when you're releasing it to the world. I think any documentary filmmaker always feels sensitive about contents in their film because it's going to have some kind of real-world ramification, large or small. But when it's a ramification to your own personal family, what was that like? I mean, do you think that all the participants in this film were fully ready, prepared for that moment, or what was the backdrop of the festival also like a kind of people coming to terms with what it meant to have different versions of the story suddenly out in the world?
It's funny because I mean, I've always been a much bigger documentary fan than I am of fiction. I mean, if I can watch a film, it will always be, a documentary. I mean, it's very, I would say, rare that I get myself out to see anything other than documentary. So it's funny in a way that it took me this long to make a documentary, but it was precisely the ethical quandaries and problems with making documentaries and using real people for a story that I think stopped me for so long. I would have an idea, I would work on it, I would develop it, and then I would get stuck on what could that potentially do to that person's life, or what could, what does that mean for that group of people? And it was so paralyzing for me. In a strange way, it was easier for me to take that on with my family and with the people I loved, because I didn't have any doubt in my mind about, I think because I knew them so well and I knew I would have to suffer for the consequences if there were any, I felt strangely empowered by that. Like there wasn't going to be some awful fallout in someone's life that wasn't going to necessarily affect me as the filmmaker, and that was comforting. And which isn't to say I won't one day make a documentary about people other than my family, but it was a really good first documentary to make for that reason. I think that, my family kind of got a kick out of it. Like, I mean, I didn't know what to expect. I was in tears before, the first public screenings, thinking like, what if I've kind of exposed all of you, some of whom are very private people, in a way that you don't want to be exposed. And I think there have certainly been uncomfortable moments for some of them, of people coming up to them on the street and telling, as one of my siblings likes to say, like, I don't want to hear every stranger's family story from beginning to end again. Like, it's unbelievable. Like, walking down the street, people are like telling her their family story. So I think there have been moments where people have felt uncomfortable with it, but generally I think it's been really fun and weird. And I think I have an adventurous family, and a family that likes just crazy curveballs coming at them and having to deal with stuff. And so I think that it's generally been a positive experience. Although I think, as the film is honest about, I don't think it's the film anyone else would have necessarily made about this, but they've all been incredibly supportive.
Often as filmmakers, we're so focused on just getting to that first step, that first festival, that first encounter with an audience, that it's hard to look past that or even imagine. So I wonder what it's been like the past year as this film goes further, goes to different countries, and also probably the same questions come up. The film is released in spring in the U.S., and people are asking you the same questions that you were answering 8 months earlier. What was that process like?
It was a lot more interesting with this film than it's been for me in the past, either as an actor or with my other two films. I think there were many more repetitions of the same questions with my first two films than with this film. I felt like it was actually really fascinating to get to have conversations about this film with people, because people's responses surprised me. People really connected with, one character or another character, one of the people in the documentary or another, and brought so much of their own family to it and life, that actually I felt like in Sundance there was a moment where this lovely guy who I work with, this publicist, was with me, and he said, like, I have to leave the room because the stories the journalists are telling you about their own families are getting to me. They're too intense. And so generally, like, half the interviews would be about their family stories, and it turns out that film journalists have like the craziest family It's just, well, it just explains a whole lot. But like, it's just like, you can't take too much of it in a day, but it is amazing.
There's a reason they're trying to escape into the movie theater.
I think that's right. Like, let's live in other people's stories for a while. But no, I mean, that was a real gift of getting to put this film out into the world. Was I found that I got to hear more about other people than I had to talk about my own family. And it was kind of a privilege. I mean, I did hear amazing stories.
So I want to go back to the process of making the film, from the time you had the idea, but the impressions I have from the interviews I've read is that you went through several different iterations before arriving at the place you did. Can you talk about some of those steps?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing that happened was, Iris and I basically, without knowing what the film would be, decided to interview my dad for 4 or 5 days. And we just...
I'm curious, did you know it would be a film, or was it partly maybe just going to be a family history?
I mean, the idea was that maybe it would be a film, but I just wanted to have it recorded. And that was really...
Is that the interview we see in the kitchen?
Exactly, yeah. So that, you know, I thought would be a day-long interview, and it ended up being about 4 or 5 days, which, you know, we organized for, but I didn't think we'd use the time, and we did. And we just sort of sat and hashed it out. And, you know, Iris had made a short film, a short doc called Point of Departure about her own family that was at the Real Asian Festival a couple of years earlier. And it was using Super 8 footage from her family. And I just remember the first kind of shot of that film with the words that came up with that. I just was sobbing uncontrollably immediately. And there was something about somebody looking at their family and, you know, looking with Super 8 that had such immediate nostalgia and power for me. And so we had that in mind. So we did that interview, and then, you know, Anita came on board and we talked more and more, and I started writing treatments, and, you know, the treatments got more and more elaborate. I did the Canadian Film Centre, the CFC NFB doc program, which was a year-long development program, which this film would never have been made without, because it forced me to keep working on it, and there are many times I didn't want to. And, you know,
so
but
just having the structure, just knowing they accepted me, I better follow through on this.
Exactly. And, you know, it was great because, you know, because I didn't know anything about how to make a documentary, and I'm a huge documentary fan, but I didn't know anything about the process. I just kept writing and writing and writing and writing until I think I had 300-page single-spaced scripts for the film that were like little novels that I would keep distributing to this group of documentary filmmakers who are quite experienced, and they would patiently read like every draft of these little novels I was in. And then finally someone who shall remain nameless stood up and went, okay, so I think, Sarah, can we just all agree in the room that we're gonna stop writing now? No more writing. Stop. Like no one wanted to read anything else. They were like, you need to just start shooting things. And that was a real departure for me, because I was used to only shooting when I was completely and absolutely prepared and knew what I was going to get. And that was a lot harder for me to wrap my head around than I thought it would be, that idea of not being able to control everything. So, you know, in some of those scripts, you know, I think one of the main ideas was that everything you see in the film was going to be framed by a sequence in a theater, where on stage, each person in the film would present their version of the story. We would go to the screen behind them and show the Super 8 version of their film with a voiceover and animation. I went to the animation studio at the NFB. They gave me a whole tour. Like, there's a whole animation component. And then in the audience would be all of the people who were subjects in the documentary who would fight about the version that had been presented. So it was basically the film that it ended up being, but it was divided into these segments with an argument in the theater that would be somewhat scripted and also spontaneous. And I think that I had a feeling I would stop before I got to that theater sequence, but I was like, we gotta make it to the theater. We've gotta keep going to, and then, you know, as I suspected when, you know, we were in the editing room, we realized like we really don't need that theater. And Nita brilliantly had forced me to have 2 cameras for my dad recording his voiceover, and I thought that would just be voiceover, but I wanted to, you know, impress my friends at Tattersall by getting awesome sound in a great studio. And so we went into this studio, we decided to film my dad, and Nita decided we really needed to film me as well. And then that, we realized, became the frame, like that was the theater sequence that we could come back to as the reference of how we were telling this story, and to not leave out the construction that we were creating, but since that was what the film was about.
I want to ask you, when you interviewed your dad, how much was new to you?
Mm-hmm. I think that maybe how things affected him emotionally was new to me. So my dad is a brilliant storyteller, and he's very funny, and he's incredibly rational in his emotions in a way. Like he doesn't respond to things the way most people respond to them. He's got a way of being kind of intellectual about emotional issues. And I guess it was surprising to me that after a couple of days of talking about stuff, you know, that he had emotions well up that I think surprised us all. And I think that was something I wasn't expecting. yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of other things as well, but it's so strange how when you make a film about something to do with your life, the film starts to overshadow what you knew about your life. So it's also strange with this film because it's everybody else's version. I sometimes forget what my own is. I sometimes will find myself telling someone the story who doesn't know it and realize I'm actually saying something from someone's interview in the film, but it actually contradicts what my memory is. But that's become my version now. Like I'm having a hard time actually remembering what my version of events is.
It's like they say about memories. It's, you know, are you really remembering something, or are you remembering a photograph you had of it, or someone else telling you? What was the period, like how long a period was it where you were interviewing everyone else? Like how long did it take to collect all the interviews that made it in the film?
Do you remember? Iris is here. Do you remember how long that period that would be over? 3 years? Okay. Oh God. Yeah, 3 years. I think about, so 3 years. And so we would take breaks and come away from it and then do some editing with, you know, the archival footage we had and the interviews we had to get more interviews. We had a lot of, thankfully, periods to edit in between shooting and in between the various stages. So, and before we shot the recreations, we had, you know, a whole period of editing everything we had with just black for where the recreations would be. So there was a lot of time to sort of restructure and reimagine things as we went along.
So if anyone here has not seen Stories We Tell, maybe you want to cover your ears for this question. But you talked about how you had this early idea of things taking place on a stage, and it, you know, somehow adapted into the structure of the film that you wind up. And, you know, when I think about that film and I think about how I watched it and totally accepted these 8mm movies as real films, even though like a little bit in the back of my head I was like, wow, that's really fortuitous that someone was there. Oh, come on, you did too. Talk to me about the process of like how you knew that was going to work.
Well, I think we were a little bit shocked by how it worked because I think our idea was we wanted to have moments where the audience wondered if what they were seeing was real or if what they were seeing was recreated, in the same way that, you know, I, as going through this personal history and asking all of these questions of people, was constantly wondering, is what I'm hearing real, or is it, you know, your memory imbued with nostalgia? Is it what you want to remember? Is it what you're saying to protect someone? Like, what is real and what isn't? And it was a constant kind of tightrope walk I was walking going through the story myself. And I think we wanted to give the audience that parallel experience of, you know, or just having a question, is that a recreation or is that real archival? It was, I think, surprising and it was thrilling, but surprising to us that so many people didn't know, they didn't even have a sense they were recreations until like 3/4 of the way through the film, or some people even at the credits. I mean, even after we reveal me directing.
I knew before the credits.
Okay, good, nice. But yeah, but it's interesting though, like that sequence of me directing the actors and, you know, on camera, that sometimes actually doesn't clue into people as well. In fact, like somebody I know who's a really great film critic said to me that they thought that that I had CGI'd myself into old footage with my mother. So, you know, I think that shocked us, or, you know, and it just occurred to us that at one of our final sort of, when we started showing the film to people, it still had a little way to go, like 2 weeks of editing left. And I remember, you know, a writer I hugely respect and who knows a ton about film and has written about film, and we were talking about Rebecca Jenkins, who's, you know, I think really sells the film in a way because she plays my mother and she's so brilliant what she did. And we were talking about Rebecca Jenkins and how great she was. And he said, why is everybody talking about Rebecca Jenkins? What does she have to do with anything? And we were like, well, she plays my mom. And she was like, your mom plays your mom. Like, what are you talking about? Like, and there was a moment where I thought he was crazy and having a nervous breakdown. But then we started to realize that people are thinking this is real. So I feel like the idea of really fooling people and wanting to fool people would be something that I would instinctually just reject on ethical grounds. Like, you know, as a documentary watcher, I feel like if someone intentionally is trying to mess with me, I get kind of mad. So it's not something we would have set out to do so specifically. We certainly wanted to match it close enough to raise the question. But I think between Rebecca and Leah Carlson, who is our art department, our amazing hair and makeup team, incredible wardrobe, and then Iris exhaustively and crazy-makingly testing every Super 8 stock and camera in the city to try to match it. I think that kind of sold it in a way that went a little bit beyond what we had hoped for, and it was lovely and a great surprise. But it was certainly a surprise that people really didn't know until that reveal.
I may be asking a naive question here, forgetting some detail of the film, but do you have actual 8mm footage of your family that you could kind of use as a guide?
Oh, so that's important information. So I think 40% of it is real. So it is actually a ton of it is my mother, and it is Super 8 footage of my family. And then we did these recreations, hoping that they would match enough that people would wonder what's what.
I never really sussed out before.
Yeah. So at least 40% is real. Yeah.
So at one point you had this idea of doing this stage thing. Eventually it gave way to this 8mm approach. What was the creative moment in between there that led the transition from one to the other?
Well, I think that the stage sequence was just going to be what we did after we did everything else. And I think then when we were cutting together what we had, we realized we didn't have to add that extra layer on top. So it was more like taking out layers and simplifying as opposed to completely changing direction. Certainly the structure we played with a lot. So there's a revelation in the film that my mother actually was married before her marriage to my dad, and had an affair with my dad and had lost her 2 kids in a custody battle. And that decision to reveal that halfway through the film as opposed to background information, that's something that would have come later. But it was mostly sort of structural ideas of when to give people certain information. And the idea was, again, to, with this new piece of information, we want you to now see everything you've seen in a totally different light. Because again, that was my experience going through this, was you would find out some small piece of information or a big piece of information about your family history that made you see everybody's behavior and everything anybody else had said in a totally different context than before.
I may have to say one thing that stands out to me about the film is its feeling of originality and its feeling that you developed a kind of storytelling language specifically for this film that is unique to this film. But I wonder if there were in the process of getting there, if it was helpful for you to look at other films, if there were other things that you were drawing from.
And that was another thing that was so invaluable about the CFC NFB lab, was I was surrounded by amazing documentary filmmakers and filmmakers who would come in and to mentor us, and they would kind of funnel me films. So I feel like I got to see this just deluge of both personal films and also films played with versions of the same story. So the ones that stood out for me that I thought about a lot were The 5 Obstructions by Lars von Trier and F is for Fake by Orson Welles, were the two that I really, those recommendations were hugely appreciated. I think both of them were recommended to me by John Walker.
So you talked about a difference you had to encounter moving from fiction films to documentaries that just doesn't need that much writing, or maybe it did. Maybe that was a helpful part of the process. But I wonder if you can reflect on other kinds of differences or similarities in the process between fiction and documentary.
I feel like there was so little that was similar, actually. One thing that surprised me was, knowing how many of my documentary filmmaker friends have trouble getting financed for their fictional films, that became hilarious to me. Like when I tried to make a doc, and it was like, I think comparatively it's easier to go from being a fictional filmmaker to making a documentary. It's hilarious to me that should be easier, because documentaries are so much harder to make. And there's nothing in making, I think, a fictional film that prepares you at all for making a doc. So I was surprised to find that out, because I know people do move sometimes seamlessly between the two mediums, but I found it really challenging. And also it's deceptively hard because up front it's so much easier. Like, it's such a small crew, you're so mobile, you can, do stuff at the last minute, things don't cost $1 million if you change your mind. Like, there's so much more freedom and seemingly there's more ease in the process when you're shooting. And then it just comes and kicks you in the ass in the editing room. And you're like, ha, you thought it was gonna be easy. It's actually a nightmare. I found that like really the process of documentary editing, I just couldn't believe how confused it's possible to get as a human being. It was just stunning. And thank God I had, Mike Munn, who's, such a veteran and also the most patient human being in the world, was able to kind of guide me through it and was able to, I felt the more space I gave him, the better the film got, the more I liked the film. So I had a great relationship with him, which made it easier. But I couldn't believe how complicated and difficult it was. And that thing of not being able to control anything. Like, you actually have to make a movie out of what you get. And it's so difficult and requires, I think, so much more rigorous thinking, I think, than making a fictional film. So yeah.
And I guess there's the whole layer of real life ramifications. And take This Waltz, you didn't, the people say in the audience that wasn't their actual relationship.
That wasn't, sorry.
That wasn't the relationship of real people when you're making a fiction film.
Right.
That you have to sit through that first screening, like wondering how they're taking this. Right,
no, exactly. And that, was that terror of, is this going to hurt someone? Is someone going to feel betrayed by this? Is someone going to feel not heard? And yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I want to talk to more documentary filmmakers about how they deal with negative responses from their subjects when they're not family, and how I don't know if anyone here has experience with that, but I'd be really curious to hear about it.
We'll go to questions in just a minute. I'd wondered if this would be a one-off documentary, if you only made this as a documentary because it was a personal story you had to tell, or having been through this, could you see yourself taking on another nonfiction story and film?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, documentary is my favorite medium, so it would feel weird to me to not, spend a good chunk of my life trying to work in it. But I feel like it's much more intimidating to me to make a documentary than it is to make a narrative film. I sort of feel like I don't get angry when a fictional film is bad, and I tend to get mad when documentaries are bad. And I feel like unless I don't know, have a subject where I know I could have like an original take on it or had something meaningful to say, I think it would be scary. And also, I do think you invest more of your life and your heart into a documentary than you would into another kind of film, because you are dealing with real people and the stakes are just naturally so much higher.
Let's bring up the lights and open this up to some questions. We've got some microphones. We'll start with this gentleman in white. Stand by for a microphone, sir. Yeah, getting you a microphone.
Hey, you say you found it more difficult going from the narrative to doc form. For a first-time documentary filmmaker, what would you say would make it easier? More preparation in the story, or do you have any insight on what could possibly make that transition easier?
Well, I do think being in that lab really helped, because I could ask all of these really experienced documentary filmmakers certain questions. So, I feel like one of the things that I wish I'd figured out earlier was just in an interview setting to let there be way more silence after a question. So if someone was answering the question, when there was a silence, to not find that awkward, but to just wait through it. Because I just found that the best moments I got with people happened when they were finished their answer and then had a moment to think, and you let that silence hang, and then they felt the need to fill it. And generally those were the most interesting moments we had. But I think it's more of just a psychological thing, if you're at all a controlling person, to let go and be present, and to be very prepared, but to not have preconceptions about what you're going to get or where it's going to go. And also to be, yeah, I mean, I really felt like meditation was the only thing that really prepared me for making a documentary, was that ability to just like, am I breathing? What do I feel? What's happening? You know, am I in this moment or not? And I felt like that was always the difference. And I would say the real lesson for me and the joy of it, which I hope to take into, you know, fiction films as well, is to just, I trusted my collaborators on this film so much more than I ever have, not because they were more trustworthy, although they were incredibly trustworthy, but just because I think I had grown up and I had enough awareness to know that I didn't know what I was doing and they did. So I was able to kind of go like, okay, this sequence, this recreation, I'm actually going to just walk into another room. Iris, you're playing me, taking a film at, you know, my mother's funeral or, you know, in the house, and like be me, and I'm leaving. And to just kind of go like, she's going to know better how to do this than I am. And with Mike, to sometimes just walk out of the editing room for a couple of days. And I just felt like, maybe also because the story was so close, I don't know if this applies in other films. I think I will use this in other films, but for me with this film, like, it was so important for other people to have their voice and to be collaborative. So I felt like that was something I learned slowly and that I would, you know, take with me.
I'm really struck by you being in this program and taking that time, because I can remember then hearing that you were in that program and thinking to myself, what does she need that for? She's an accomplished filmmaker, you know. But it strikes me that you taking the time to listen to other people and to absorb as much as you can, well, that's what makes you such a good filmmaker.
Thank you. I was away working. I was a child actor, so I was away working in grade 3 when they covered Long Division, and I never caught up. Like, I came back and I never caught up in math. I was a perfectly fine math student, and I never caught up. And so I kind of have this.
Is that what they teach at the Canadian Film Center?
Yeah, that's why I went to CFC. But no, I do feel like, because I went to the CFC for the director's program when I was about to make my first feature, when I went to make Away From Her, and it was just that feeling like if I miss this essential foundational stuff, or asking the really basic questions now, I'm always going to feel like I missed something, or that and it was true. Like, in both that and the CFC doc program, I would have missed really basic stuff that could have taken me 7 or 8 films to figure out. So it was really helpful and also to have people who are going to be generous with their time. And I think Canada is an exceptional country in that way, where our older filmmakers really want other people to succeed, and that's not always the case. Like, I know people, you know, in other smaller, you know, countries where, you know, their veteran filmmakers get hospitalized when other people are successful, literally. And I feel like we do have, you know, I think a generation of filmmakers now that's like really into supporting and nurturing younger filmmakers. So it's so awesome to be able to take advantage of that when you haven't done something before.
We get a microphone to this person up here front.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Ms. Polley. So my question is, all of your films seem, not just stories we tell, but all of them seem very personal, very close to you. And I was just wondering if, when a film is finally getting released, or when you're finished editing, do you find a difference in letting go a film like Stories We Tell to the public versus one of your fictional films? Or is it like that process of letting go, does it change depending on what type of film you're releasing? Or do you mostly go through the same process for all of them?
Certainly we were more nervous. I was more nervous with Stories We Tell than with, you know, my other 2 films, Go Out Into the World. But I was more happy to let this one go than I've ever been. I just want to like go, like be other people's, somebody else watch it. Like you know, it was a very claustrophobic experience to make. And towards the end, I thought I was going batty. Like, sitting in a room staring at your family for 8 to 10 hours a day is like not something any therapist would recommend for years. So I was more than happy for it to be out in the world, but it was really scary, you know, initially, and putting the story out there for the first time, and, you know, posting that, you know, I posted a blog letting people know what the story was about. As soon as the Venice screening started, we sent out a post with the story of what it was about, because the Canadian press wasn't there, and they had sat on the story for so many years, so we wanted to make sure like they had it at the same time at least, even if they were seeing the screening, I think, actually in Toronto at the same time as the Venice screening. So that was terrifying, just kind of putting out a piece of your life that you might, originally I don't think I ever wanted public, and it was a very strange, surreal experience, but I think I'm always more than happy to let go of a film and to not work on it anymore. I'm kind of a lazy person. So I'm not one of these people who's like, I could have just worked on a little bit more, and I'm always like happy to say goodbye.
So when you think of your 3 films, do you see something that connects them?
Yeah, a few things. I think thematically there's a lot in common with all of them. I'm curious about the fact that a lot of it has to do with like female restlessness or something. Do you know, there's something in that, and I don't know exactly what it is. It's not a conscious thing, but when I look at sort of Julie Christie and Michelle Williams and my mom, there's kind of a line between those characters somewhere. Certainly when I look back at Away From Her and I see like the last image of Away From Her, or one of the last images of Away From Her is, Julie Christie's character as a young girl staring at the camera in Super 8. Smiling and then turning away, and it looks almost identical in the framing to actual footage of my mom in Super 8, but I wasn't aware of that at all when I made that film. It's only now you kind of can see the parallels. But I think that that's probably the case with a lot of filmmakers. You're mining a lot of the same territory from different ways and angles all the time, and it's probably something in your subconscious you don't have a firm handle on with, that can be articulated. Otherwise, you wouldn't be making the films about them. I
mean, it strikes me that now you've got this kind of distance. You've got these 3 films, and you can start making those connections if you become more self-conscious about them as you think about what your next project is going to be. If you feel like, well, this is my space, this is what I am good at, or if you think, I want to try something different. Is that a...
Yeah, I think that's where you get into dangers. If you can start to articulate and go like, this is my thing, and you start doing it, I'm not sure what happens to the work then. Like, I talked once to Sam Shepard about writing screenplays, and he was saying, the problem with the whole financing process where you have to explain to the financier what your film is about is, I'm not going to quote him directly, but I'm really paraphrasing, but he basically was saying, when art works or when something moves you, it's because there's something in the artist's or the writer's subconscious that touches something in your subconscious that neither of you totally understand. So as soon as you have to sit down and go like, why does this character do this? Or why is he saying this? Or what does this mean? Or what is your film about? You're probably going to be making something without power if you can answer all those questions. And I think it is a real problem. Like, and you spend so much more time in the financing process than you spend in the process of actually making the thing, that I think it's possible to really lose sight of what you're doing. I think the really amazing process with Stories We Tell was at the NFB. It's a completely different kind of pressure. Like it's a pressure to be innovative. It's a pressure to be like, what are you doing that hasn't been done? How can we experiment more? How can we think more outside of the box? Like all the pressures are to like push you creatively further than you want to go, as opposed to paring down. Like it felt like an expanding process as opposed to a minimizing process. So it was an amazing way of like kind of not getting in the way of whatever the mess is inside your head that's going to lead to you doing something that you care about. So yeah, and I noticed also Christine Kleckner's in the audience here, who was a huge part of that process, who is much more than, our coordinator and manager, but she was, a huge part of the whole development process as well from the NFB. And Anita Lee is here, and I think Ira Singh is here too, yeah. Yeah, she is, because she answered a question earlier.
I think of that process of describing your film. Steven Soderbergh said that every film pitch should end with the line, ultimately it's about hope.
That's amazing. It's perfect.
Let's take a question. This woman here in the blue, or do we right there, on the aisle there. Did I say woman? Is it a man? I'm sorry.
It's hard to tell. You can just see hair from here.
I've been called a woman for. I thought the film was very beautiful, and I enjoyed the feature films too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, though, you began talking about John Grayson, and I'm aware of some of the stands you've taken in cultural nationalism issues and things like that. Do you ever see yourself making a political film, a film that's not so intimate and personal?
Yeah, I think I have the same paralysis with making a political film that I did about documentaries, where it's like, filmmakers like Ken Loach are intimidatingly great, and they manage to make films that have something to say and are effective, but they're never they're never too literal. They're never beating over the head. They're great pieces of art as well, and I think it's so hard to do that well. I certainly see myself making a political film at some point. I just want to find a way to do it and also have it be a good film as well as just having something to say. I think I have an idea for something right now, which it's not overtly political, but it is political in the point of it. So I'm thinking about it and working on it. I also like the idea of making a political documentary, and certainly there are things I want to make documentaries about. I find that there can be a little bit of snobbery around documentaries that just make a really effective point. And I feel like if a documentary is kind of ethical and fair and makes a point really well, it doesn't have to be a great piece of art. But I feel like that's not necessarily embraced by the film community generally. And so some of the ideas I have for films they're not pieces of art. They're just things that have something to say and that a story I want to tell. And I think I feel a little bit nervous about doing that based on so many of the comments I hear around documentaries that aren't, breaking the form, like tearing the form apart as it seems. Like I feel like some stories just kind of need to be told well. So at some point,
you fucked yourself up by setting a pretty high bar.
Well, I don't know if I. I don't know.
I mean, it's intimidating enough for other filmmakers to try to aspire, but you yourself,
Thank you.
Good luck. Let's take another question right here in the front.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So I wonder what it's like directing yourself. The reenactments are not really directing yourself, but do you anticipate that you'll be doing more of that in your future films? Or is it kind of a harrowing experience or something that you gravitate towards naturally?
I had never thought about directing myself. I mean, for me, like, making films was the great escape from acting, which I probably wanted to do since I was 11 years old. And so for me, it was like, why the hell would I want to act when I finally got free of it? And I think it's just really recently that that I thought, like, maybe it would be interesting. I think I wouldn't play like a large part, but maybe playing a small part in a film I directed would be interesting, just to to see if I could do it. I'd make it something I could cut out if it didn't work. But I think I would like to kind of see, where I could go and try to play a character maybe that I hadn't played before. But, I think that the agony of spending time with yourself in an editing room, I don't know how anybody survives that. I mean, you get so annoyed by the actors you work with, even the great ones, when you're sitting in an editing room with them all day, by their little habits, like, even if they've done an amazing job, just by the end of it, you just want to kill them. And so I feel like people have enough self-loathing in their lives without that being them, so... Maybe.
This question back there, we'll get that gentleman.
Sarah, you talked a bit about structure before, but I was wondering, because you've been talking about the editors and the whole process, whether could you bring us into it a bit more in terms of how you actually work through the whole idea of this very elaborate structure that you finally came to?
Can you just say the last part again?
Well, I just want to get I want to get more into the whole process of how you were able to arrive at the structure, because it's very complicated and it works so well. But I'm sure it wasn't necessarily the first thing you thought of at all.
So the first thing I did before we actually set out and did most of the interviews was I sat down with my dad's interview for about a month, and I just kept going through it and going through it and going through it, and out of that interview picked apart what were the kind of most interesting things and themes and issues he was addressing. And from that, I constructed my questions to everyone else. And then we we put together kind of all of the answers, to those questions. And then, we did the thing that a lot of people do of index cards, and sort of made these kind of episodic things out of these out of these sections. And then I was given all this amazing advice by other documentary filmmakers how to organize that material later, but it was too late. We'd already done it, but I would do it on the next one. It's like 2 stars for funny, 4 stars for really funny. It's like, shit. So we had, our index cards, and then we were trying to construct, so then we looked at all our archival footage and saw what that could illustrate. Then we sat down and looked at everything we had cut together in our, whatever it was, an 8-hour cut with everything before we had done the recreations. And me, Iris Ng, Anita Lee, I think Christine, you were there too, and Christine Kleckner and Leah Carlson, did I say? We all sat down, and Mike, and from that, we together scripted what the recreations would be. So, we'd say, okay, Johnny overhears the phone call. What's that going to look like? And what would that realistically be? Like, no one's just filming someone having a phone call. So Anita said, well, what if it's a kid bugging their mom? Like, you see a door opening and closing like this, and we're sort of filming, and we can kind of see a bit of her, but she's irritated. So, like, how do we create real life in the middle of what we need to illustrate? Or how do we create the moment in the background so that actually somebody was just in that bar filming that Russian band? Oh, and like in the background in the corner, you can kind of see Harry and Diane because they pan over. Oh, but then they pan back. Like just figuring out how realistically these things could end up on camera, but clearly not intentionally for a film. So then Mike was playing. So Iris was always playing a role. Iris is playing the role of, the kid running around with a Super 8 camera, or the dad filming his kids. And then Mike was playing the role of the editor, trying to find whatever footage would work to end up, to illustrate these points. So instead of being like, okay, here's the moment, which we did sometimes literally shoot the moment, we go, okay, that's too literal. What if you were like digging through footage and you had to use something? What would work as an editor normally? So we'd look through the recreations with that character of an editor in mind. So we were all very confused and basically all playing a part as we made the documentary.
Time for maybe one more question. We'll take this gentleman here in the blue.
Ron Grainer, did you ever consider having somebody?
There's a call for you, Sarah.
Having someone else go through the footage and look at it rather than yourself, because I think as a filmmaker you're personally involved, and someone objective might have a different take on it.
Well, certainly, Mike was a huge part of that process, and all of the other collaborators. So I certainly relied on their judgment a lot, and wanted to hear a lot about what they were hearing and what they were seeing as opposed to what I was hearing and seeing. I mean, even just in the interview with my dad, when we were doing that interview for 4 days, going out for lunch with everybody who was on the shoot, and talking to Sanjay Mehta, who did our sound, and Iris, and going like, oh my God, I'd be like, oh my God, wasn't my dad so annoying just now? And they'd be like, no, he was lovely. You have no perspective on your own family. So constantly getting that response to like, who are my siblings actually? If you're just watching them, who is my dad? And having to kind of see the people closest to you in your life as a stranger would see them, or as somebody making a film about them would see them, was a really interesting exercise. And I think what was really interesting was I've always been really close to my family, but I feel like they were so much more interesting and lovely than I thought they were, because I finally let them talk, right? I mean, that's the problem with family, is no one ever sits down with their family and asks them to recount a part of the family history from beginning to end without interrupting, with your own perspective. There will always be one good, oh, but there was that, or even just to add something. But if you get to the end of that story, whatever it is in your family history, just from someone else's point of view, and you don't interrupt, I highly recommend it as an exercise, because it's incredible what you learn that you didn't know they thought, or what they experienced that has never come up. So that was an amazing gift of making this film, was not interrupting your family.
Before we wrap up, I want to go back to the free Tarek and John. What can people do? Where can they go to follow this or sign a petition?
Sure. So call the Egyptian embassy. Go to tarekandjohn.com. Go to change.org/free Tarek and John to sign the petition. Tweet about it as much as you can. Please keep updated on the website to see what what they're calling for the next actions to be, and just please don't stop talking about it until they're home. We just want to make sure, this stays in the spotlight and that people don't let the ball drop.
People can follow your Twitter account, which is Sarah E. Polley. You can follow my Twitter account, Tom Powers, and we'll continue updating the Tarek and John. I'll also continue updating things that have come out of the doc conference when things are published and when clips go. That wraps it up for our 5th annual doc conference. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Sarah Polley.
Thank you.